Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. On behalf of the Lower Merion Historical Society, I welcome you to tonight's presentation on learning about slavery in the greater Philadelphia area. My name is Erin Vetley, Vice President of the Society. Our mission is to preserve and share the rich history of Lower Merion and Narberth by broadening the kinds of stories we tell and engaging our community in the process. And so tonight we will go back to some of the earliest days of Lower Merion after it was settled by Welsh Quaker refugees in 1682 and spotlight several stories that have been hidden in the historical record for well over 200 years. We had over 190 people register for this webinar, most from our area, but we had some from Maryland, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Iowa, and Colorado. I think the tremendous interest in this presentation indicates that this is a history that most people want to know more about and want to learn more about and want to reflect on what that means. In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker, Colin McCrossan. But before I do, I wanted to let you know that our purpose for this presentation is to launch a 225-page reader that Colin researched and wrote for us as part of his internship with us last summer. The document is available for download on our website, lowermerionhistory.org. It is a compilation of 103 pieces of evidence about slavery and enslaved people outside the city of Philadelphia, across 4 counties, Montgomery, Bucks, Chester, and Delaware, all of which at the time were vast agricultural landscapes with massive and very isolated properties miles away from each other. The evidence he has collected is from the 1730s to the 1790s, and it is all primary sources, which means newspaper advertisements for the sale of enslaved people or for the return of enslaved people, from wills and estate inventories, from deeds, from tax assessments, and many other sources. Colin has transcribed each of these documents for readability and included interpretation and explanations for words that may not be familiar. The document also includes an introductory essay on the history of slavery in our region and a shorter essay describing the types of primary sources included in the reader. In this document, you'll see evidence that predates the founding of our nation and stories that extend past the date of 1780, when the Pennsylvania State Legislature passed a law called an Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. In this document, you'll read names like Hercules, Chloe, Caesar, and Kate. You'll see families. You'll see mothers and children. You'll see records describing a 2-year-old boy named London and an elderly woman named Nanny. You'll also see names like John Jones, John Roberts, Hannah Harrison, and Frederick Bicking, all residents of Lower Merion who enslaved people. Of course, this evidence can only give us a limited view into this time and place, but it tells us something about the shape of our landscape today, about our place names, about who walked our roads hundreds of years ago, and about what the lives of our ancestors were like. And it opens the door for us to think about what this evidence means for us today. It is my pleasure to introduce Colin McCrossan. Colin is a JD candidate at Temple University Beasley School of Law. He recently completed his master's in history at Villanova University. He has widely shared his research about the history of slavery in the Philadelphia area with public audiences, including as the inaugural scholar in residence for the Community Breakfast Collaborative of the Main Line. His summer internship with the Lower Merion Historical Society was sponsored by the Albert LePage Center for History in the Public Interest. Welcome, Colin.
Thank you, Erin. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and get the presentation up. So welcome to the event. My name's Colin McCrossan, as Erin said. Let me set my timer so we're on track. I am, as Erin said, a current law student at Temple University. And this presentation is titled Learning About Slavery in the Greater Philadelphia Area. Pretty much the goal of the presentation is to talk about this reader, this resource that I created with the Society this past summer, which everybody can view online. This image I'll get to in the middle of the presentation. I'll tell you what that is. So who am I? Brief bio. I'm from Ardmore, so near Lower Merion, Haverford Township side. Not that it really matters. I was at Villanova University, a master's student studying history, mainly the history of slavery in the Philadelphia area for 2 years. And Villanova is lucky enough to have a really great public history center called the Albert LePage Center for History and the Public Interest. Albert LePage is an amazing person who donated a gift to the university, and they founded this center. They supported financially the internship with Lower Merion Historical Society and gave me the resources and the support to create this reader. So that's where this kind of came from. The research based that the reader is based on is over 2 or 3 years of research. It's not everything that I've found or that I've talked about. So there's some editorial discretion. This is a picture of the center at Villanova. I encourage everybody to look at their website and more of the great work that they do. I also want to give a content warning. The history of slavery is very disturbing. It's emotional. It can be stressful for viewers and people to learn and talk and think about. So make sure that you are okay during the presentation, and I just want to acknowledge that in the beginning. Okay, so what is this thing that I'm talking about? So this is what it looks like. It's a reader. It's a documentary history. It's a collection of primary source documents about slavery in this area. So primary sources are pieces of historical evidence that were created in the past in a certain time period. The goal of the reader is really there are two main goals of the reader, or the goal has two parts. One is to introduce people to the history of slavery in this area. And the second part of that introduction is to create knowledge about it via primary sources. So to help people learn about it, introduce them to it, and to create public knowledge about this history and the people that make it up. I wanted to make this history accessible to people. I didn't want to just write a journal article or something that would be behind a paywall, but something that's online that people can download, they can read, they can share. One question might be about, why isn't this just about Lower Merion? I mean, this is the Lower Merion Historical Society. The history of slavery, as you can read about and as I'll talk about later on in the presentation, really is beyond just one township's border. An enslaved person who lived in Lower Merion, for example, did not just live within the confines of the township. They were moving around. They were connected to the city, to other people. If we only see the history of slavery in a siloed view, just in kind of Lower Merion or Norristown or Ridley, we don't really get a comprehensive or more textured picture of what this history was like. So the presentation is about this reader, the documents about it, how I created it, and why. Another goal of the reader is to remember enslaved people, to recognize them, to say their names, to memorialize them. These are people who suffered under extremely brutal and terrible conditions, and this is an effort to speak their names into existence again. And also to generate discussion. What does this history mean to us? People who live in this area, what should happen next? Anything? I hope to kind of generate a discussion, get people talking, thinking about this, learning about it, sharing it with the people that they know. So the reader is made up of a few parts. The first is the cover page, which looks like that. The second part is a table of contents, this is a clipping of what it looks like. There's an introductory essay, as Aaron mentioned. Then there's a part about the historical evidence of slavery. What are the sources that I'm using? What kinds of documents are in the reader? There's a glossary to help people learn about the terminology. There's a whole 2-3 pages of recommended reading, which is pretty much a compilation of 30-40 years of scholarship about slavery in Pennsylvania, the American North, public history in slavery, the meanings of slavery. And then it's just the documents. The bulk of the reader is just all of the primary sources. So in total, it's 237 pages. It's 103 documents. So there's plenty to learn about, and you can jump to one section or you can go back to another. So you can really get lost really in the stories and the people of the contents. What I just mentioned, the historical evidence of slavery, these are the kinds of sources that are in the reader. This is clipped from the reader itself. So this is all the types of documents that are included in the resource. There are slave sale advertisements, there are excerpts from laws, there are court cases, there are wills, letters of administration, deeds, and religious records. And you can read about all the different types and what they are in the glossary. So how did I come up with this? What inspired me? I really like his primary source readers, historical kind of document compilations. Here are two historians. This is Dr. Harvey Amani Whitfield, and this is Dr. Victoria Bissell Brown. Whitfield is at, I believe, the University of Alberta or Calgary now, and Dr. Bissell Brown is retired from Grinnell College in Iowa. They both created those respective readers, one about Black slavery in the Maritimes, so Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, that part of Canada, and Dr. Brown created a reader about American history in general. So that's kind of that was on my mind. This is his. I have it conveniently here. His book. I don't know why I thought that would work, but it didn't. Anyway, you can see the image of the title there. That's what inspired me. I thought I have all this research, all these documents, all these people, all these names. This would be 100 journal articles or 50 different talks. Where can I put it all together? Where can I just compile everything? And these are kind of the models that I use to think about that. So there's so I would find an original document, I would transcribe it, and then I would edit it, and then kind of think about how am I going to put these all together. Somebody who doesn't really know much about slavery, what kind of language should I use? How should I write it? What kind of design should I kind of think about to make sure that things look clean and they can be understood well? So I had just a general public audience in mind, from somebody who might be in middle school to, a scholar of 40 years, that hopefully both of those people and everybody in between could learn something from it. There's editorial discretion, of course, in any sort of reader type resource. So I chose different sources based off of length, of people, of how much evidence there was about them. And there were issues with rights to reproduction. Some documents are owned by private entities, and legally, the Historical Society doesn't have the rights to fully reproduce them and show them and in their original form, but we can still transcribe them and use the words. And so that was kind of playing around with what's in the public domain and what's not, and what can we put online. So those are all kind of the ideas and things underlying the creation of it. So how did this all work? So we have a document. Like I just said, I would find a document. So this document is a fugitive slave ad for an enslaved boy who we don't know his name, and an enslaved Black man named Hilaire. This was posted by an enslaver in Philadelphia in a Philadelphia newspaper. This is actually at the Lower Merion Historical Society. This is in their collection. So that just gives you one sense of how massive the Historical Society's collection is, how rich it is, some of the documents, how old some of the things are. I mean, fugitive slave advertisements are extremely rare because they were, found in newspapers or they were printed on broadsides, and they're really ephemeral things. They, weren't really meant to be kept around. So I would locate a source, this fugitive ad from the Historical Society. Then I would read the original, which is on the screen. So that's what the original looks like. Then I would transcribe it. So I would read the document, go through it, try to understand the words if it was kind of illegible. Then I would put it in the format that I developed for the reader. And then I would kind of write an introduction, which is up here, about in this document, an enslaver by the name of Citizen LaSalle advertised for an enslaved man he owned named Hilaire and an enslaved boy who escaped from him in 1793. And the introduction goes on. I would fit it into a template that I designed. There would be a document number, an introduction, the actual document, a citation. So this is actually one of my favorite slides of the presentation. I said this to Aaron. this is kind of an anatomy of the document. So these are all of the parts, if we're really looking at how this works, that went into each page, each document in the reader. So I gave every document, once I had all the ones that I wanted, I numbered them all, I kind of categorized them, I'd write editorial introductions, transcribe them, make sure that they were cited. There are certain terms from the history of slavery that are obviously offensive or confusing and might have different meanings. So I, sometimes included an editorial note. Then I had to number all the pages once I had everything kind of designed and ready to go, and give the documents a title. So that's just kind of a look at some of the process of how did this work? How did I put stuff together? All right, so the next kind of portion of the presentation, I want to share three highlights from the reader. Two of them are kind of related because they're connected to Lower Merion, and the third is about two people who are featured in the cover page here from this clip from the estate inventory of this guy. Okay, and why do I want to do this? Because the sources in the reader, they tell stories. They don't tell them inherently, but we can interpret, we can read the documents in different ways, look at them from different historical perspectives, use different methodologies and tools that historians and other people have developed over the past 40, 50 years to think about them in different ways. And so in the introductory essay, for example, of the reader, I talk about how should we look at sources? What questions should we ask? What can we know from historical documents? What can't we? Who is speaking? Who is silent? What does that mean to look at something as a person and looking at your positionality of where you come from and your background and your demographic, and how does that affect your relationship to a document? What does it mean emotionally to think about the people and the places and this system that is so integral to our country? All right, so the first document is a fugitive slave ad for an enslaved man named Kent by a white man named John Jones in Lower Merion. And this is June 21st in 1784. Just for people who don't know, I think just to be clear, a fugitive slave ad is an advertisement that a white enslaver or someone else wrote and paid to post in a newspaper that described an enslaved person or enslaved people who had freed themselves, who had ran away or somehow otherwise escaped from an enslaver. And the advertisements were to get these enslaved people back. They would describe them, sometimes what they were wearing, who they were, any skills they had, language abilities, proposed desired destination. And historians have really used these to chart and to think about, theorize, and to note enslaved people's resistance to slavery. And there's a whole scholarly debate about how enslaved people resisted, to what degree, how did conditions change. So in this advertisement, John Jones is offering $8 as a reward for this man, Kent, that he enslaved. And he says, ran away from the subscriber in Lower Merion Township, Montgomery County, on the 15th of this instant, which was in June. A Negro man, quote unquote, Negro man, obviously extremely offensive, but that's the language of the document, named Kent, a well-made, likely young fellow, about 19 years of age, 5 feet 9 or 10 inches high. He is rather impudent, born in North Carolina, had on when he went away a light-colored homespun jacket, much worn, a shirt, pants, they were much worn as well, an old waistcoat. Whoever secures him in a jail so that the subscriber, John Jones, can have him again will get the $8 reward and any other reasonable charges that somebody might incur trying to get him. And then he has a pretty common note in fugitive slave ads of, anybody who's got a ship, do not let this guy on, because that's just going to help him even further, and John Jones wants him back. So historians have theorized and looked at fugitive slave advertisements like this and actually used them to think about people like Kent's lives. Sometimes these are the only records that exist about enslaved people, notices for their capture. And there was a whole economy of people who were of white people and others who, worked to capture people who were fugitive slaves. There was slave trade, slave trading, slave kidnapping. I mean, kidnapping of free black people even. So Kent running away from John Jones is an extremely dangerous and dramatic act. And the fact that Jones posted this advertisement, he was serious about getting him back. He described him. He was born in North Carolina, which is extremely interesting to me because many enslaved people came from many different places, and we can kind of trace a little bit of his genealogy, some of his details, some of who he was, his personhood. Historians also then say, well, what shouldn't we believe from fugitive slave ads? What might enslavers or slave owners exaggerated about or lied or insulted enslaved people? These are the types of questions that are in the beginning of the reader to think about each document. What does that mean? Another big question that might be on people's minds is, well, where's the original? Why can't we see the original? This is just a transcription. So if we look down here, we have the citation, the Pennsylvania Gazette, access via Accessible Archives, Inc. So that's a private corporation that owns copies of the Pennsylvania Gazette, which was at one time owned by Benjamin Franklin, who was also an enslaver, and whose views on slavery scholars have looked at and written about, and so he's gotten, a little bit of attention about that, but most people don't really think about Franklin and being an enslaver. They think of him as an anti-slavery person, but it's a bit more complicated. So that's why we don't have the original in the reader. Why? Well, legal reasons, and we don't own the society doesn't own the original, but we can still, use the words and think about Kent and John Jones' lives. Okay. So the second document is another fugitive ad. And I said that this is connected to Lower Merion too. But the people featured in it were living in Lancaster County, so west of here. This is document 57. It's a fugitive ad for Peter and Frank by a man named Samuel Cook, by two men, named Samuel Cook and James Anderson, who were slave owners in Donegal Township in Lancaster County. And they are writing in August. And so I have it transcribed here on the left. Excuse me. They said $60 reward, which is a pretty hefty sum. Ran away from the subscribers, two likely active Negro men. They are stout, well-made fellows and very much alike. The one named Peter, who's about 25. He took with him new shirts, a wool hat, other clothing. He speaks the English and German languages, okay? Which makes sense because of German-speaking population in Lancaster County. The other named Frank, about 21 years of age, and looks down when spoken to. Okay, think about what could that mean exactly? How do we interpret a sentence like that? What kind of methodology do you think we should use? He also took with him clothing and different things. The writer said it is supposed the above fellows are gone towards Philadelphia, as they have frequently driven wagons toward that place. Interesting. Whoever secures them so that their masters may have them again shall receive the above reward, $60 or $30 for either of them, and reasonable charges. And they say it's a little bit cut off, but they say from us to the people who wrote it. So a few things I want to point out here. One is the language ability, which is very interesting. The second is that they are gone. These guys thought that they were gone towards Philadelphia. I realized when I transcribed it here, I have that spelled wrong, but we can fix that. They have frequently driven wagons toward that place. Okay, so that's why, remember in the beginning where I said, why is it not just about Lower Merion? Why is it about the greater Philadelphia area? Why not just about one township or another? Because of things like this. The sources show us that enslaved people, the enslavers, their lives were interconnected with a greater world, even though these two guys might have been enslaved, Peter and Frank, in a place like Lancaster, which is way farther out in Philadelphia. And think about, how long it might take there to get to Lancaster from Philly today. And you're in a wagon and, it's rural and, there's really no roads. I mean, that's quite a journey. And they frequently did that. So if we just focused on these two, on Peter and Frank's lives and Cook and Anderson in Lancaster County, if it was just about slavery in Lancaster County, we would get a, somewhat of a picture of who they were, maybe, what they did, what their lives could have been like. but they're going towards Philadelphia. They're connected to this regional economy. They're maybe, meeting other people in Philadelphia. We're not from this ad alone, we don't know, but we do know at least that they were going there and they went there in the past. So if we see things in a fuller picture, more in context, think about the relationships between one place and another and the people who are part of them, we learn more. We can think about this history in a deeper way. And realize that slavery is really all over the place, and it's really a part of a lot of places and communities in our country, and there's still a lot of more research to do. So this is what the advertisement looks like. How is this connected to Lower Merion? Well, it's in the collection of the Historical Society, and just to give you a little backstory, this advertisement I found with Aaron Betley in the Historical Society over this past summer, and we were looking at this newspaper, and Aaron and I are looking at it, and it's labeled old newspaper or something, and about this person's some old white person from Lower Merion. I'm like, okay, interesting, I guess. I'm flipping through, and I'm thinking in the back of my mind, well, it's an old newspaper. It's from 1793. I wonder if there are any fugitive slave advertisements. And we get to the back on page 4, and I look at this huge part of the page, and there was this ad. And it made me pause, and I got kind of emotional because you just don't see these documents. I mean, I was like, oh my God. I mean, here is a real from 1793, an actual fugitive slave advertisement. Wow. I mean, think about what this means. Here are two people who they are risking their lives to be free. They free themselves in the summer of 1793 from these guys who were determined to get them back. They're offering big money here to get these guys back. And all we know about them is what these two white guys have written in a newspaper designed to recapture them as somebody's property. Wow. I mean, and I'm holding in the society, it's kind of, summer afternoon, the sun is kind of filtering in the windows. You can kind of hear bugs outside. And Aaron and I are just kind of there, and we're holding this thing and thinking, oh my God, I mean, this is really powerful. And so moments like that kind of made me think, how can we share this with more people? How can we tell at least a part of these guys' stories? Will Peter and Frank be forgotten? No. We want to make sure that we say their names and that we talk about their lives, and from what we know, and other people like them whose contributions, whose lives were stolen by white people, but who can be remembered and acknowledged today. Okay. So the last document that we're going to talk about is document 93. And it's about Joseph and this guy named Reverend James Anderson. And it's from James Anderson's estate inventory. He lived in Lower Chichester Township for a time near his death, which was in Chester County. And this is from 1793. So when the Reverend James Anderson died, he was a Presbyterian minister, per other sources that are also featured in the reader. The people who were in charge of his estate went through and they made an inventory of all of his property, everything he owned, objects, furniture, spoons. And at 1793, he owned one person named Joseph. And in 1780, 13 years before, he had enslaved 4 people. And at that time, Joseph was listed in a slave register, which is also in the reader, as a boy. And in 1793, when Anderson died, he's listed as a man. This is a transcription of this part of the estate inventory. So we have a bed and furniture that's 7 pounds. This DO means ditto, so there's more furniture. It's got a tea table, a writing chair, a library of books, tablespoons, teaware. And Joseph is valued at 50 pounds. So here's another kind of moment where this is from the Delaware County Archives. So we can use this image because it's public property. It's in the public domain. this was another emotional moment for me in the archives, which are archival spaces are usually silent. They're a little bit austere, very formal, and I'm turning this manila envelope kind of thing in, and it's this one-page sheet from 1793, and I'm reading through, and then there's this guy Joseph, and I'm doing the quick math, and I'm like, so he was worth about five libraries of books worth of value. And this was a guy who was a minister, and he was a Presbyterian, and he said he was a Christian, and he was an enslaver, and he enslaved four people, including this guy named Joseph. So it's difficult to look at some of these sources and to read about this, and but I think it's necessary, and we need to acknowledge the role that slavery has played in a place like Lower Merion and our region. And this reader is designed to introduce people to this history in an accessible way, to bring these stories to life, to name people, to look at places, to generate discussion, and to raise, difficult questions. What do we do with this information? What did it mean to be enslaved by a minister? What was Joseph's life like? When he died, when he's being valued by somebody and assessed, what could that experience have been like for him? How dehumanizing was it? How did Joseph resist? What were his thoughts about life? What were his hopes and his dreams? And when did he get bored and, emotional? And what were his relationships? And we may never know the answers to some of those questions, but we can still think about them. And we can still think about the people who make up this history and think about us too and what we want to do with it. So Anderson was the minister of Middletown Presbyterian Church, which is featured here. This is his grave. This is the original grave up here, and this is a different thing that the church put in. So yeah, that's kind of the end of the presentation. I hope that made sense. I think it did. So yeah, thank you all for coming. I'd like to also thank the Lower Merion Historical Society again for their help and their support and all the great work that they do. Everybody check out their upcoming events and their website. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Colin. I really appreciate the care that you took with sharing this information. So we have several questions that came in when folks registered, and also some questions from the board of the society and others that have come in during the presentation. So we'll use this time to have a little bit of discussion with Colin to go a little bit deeper into some of these things that he's been talking about. So the first question wanted to talk about was something you've talked a little bit about throughout, is if you could reflect on the weight of the evidence that you've collected. What has it been like to do this research for years and to share it with our community? And how has our community responded when you have shared this information?
So definitely I've learned a lot. I've tried to also learn about what kind of biases do I bring to looking at slavery. I'm a white guy, and I'm looking at a lot of Black people's lives. What does that mean? How do I make sure that I'm being sensitive to anti-Black racism in a historic context and for today? So there's been a lot of kind of, I guess, trying to learn about doing this kind of work with slavery as a white researcher. Also, what did it mean for white people in the time too? How did slavery change them? So I've done a lot of thinking about what is race, what is racism, how did it happen in different ways? How does it affect us, and who is us? How does it affect different people in the world and society? And then that's kind of on a macro level. And then on a micro level, what does it mean when you find something, one record of someone's life, and that's all there is? It's depressing sometimes, and it can be inspiring and challenging and difficult and conflicting. And what did it mean for somebody like Joseph, or for Peter or Frank, or for the people who enslaved them? And I would go to some of these places featured in the Reader, or I'd look at these documents, and I would say nobody knows about this. I mean, I'm talking to people, and we had never learned about this. I never learned about this growing up in school, and why? Why was that? And what were the reasons behind the fact that I didn't know anything about enslaved people who, like a man named Thomas Crail, who lived on where I live, where my house is, or an enslaver named Charles Humphreys who owned a huge part of Ardmore that I had no idea. So that kind of motivated me. Um, the response has been varied. There are some people who are very interested and supportive and engaged. There are other people who have been resistive, and they don't want to talk about slavery, and it makes them feel uncomfortable. And because it brings up all the stuff I just talked about: race, racism, inequality, uh, stuff that now, is actually illegal in a lot of places. You can't teach about it. You can't talk about it in a public library or a school or, um, so it's difficult. And one thing I learned is that, this work is never finished. It's always ongoing. Research, talking with people, doing anything about slavery. We can always learn more, and we can make mistakes in how we interpret things or look at the history, but it's a process, and it's always, there's still something in the future to do as well.
That's great. Thank you, Colin. And I'll mention Colin has given several other presentations on this topic in depth. And so in the Q&A, we'll include some links to some of those presentations. We'll also email them out along with a recording of this presentation so everyone can take a look at his body of work. Next question. What are some common misconceptions people have about the history of slavery in our area? And how do you think your reader helps address these misconceptions?
One misconception is that it wasn't a part of the area's history at all. And that's just factually incorrect. The Reader and other scholars have shown that no, that's just literally false. Slavery, white people enslaved black people in the area for over 100 years, and we have it for the evidence. Another misconception is that Quakers were all against slavery, that there were no Quakers who were ever bad Quakers. But we have top prominent Quakers for many years who were slave traders. They were the mayors of Philadelphia and top politicians and government leaders in the surrounding, what is now the suburbs, who were enslavers. Some of the biggest slave-owning families were Quaker families. And the Quakers have a long and complicated history of slavery and then anti-Black racism even after slavery had ended. That's another big misconception. And many Quakers actually, when the Quaker Church told its members, you have to either free the people you enslaved or we're going to kick you out, many of them said, okay, well, we don't care. We want to still enslave these people. Another misconception is that slavery was somehow better in the North than in a place like Charleston or Georgia or the South. In my opinion, slavery is bad everywhere. I mean, there's no good, this is, good slavery. There are differences in the experiences of enslavement, meaning somebody who's enslaved in Lower Merion in a household of 5 white people and they're the only enslaved Black person. That's different than living in a place like a rice plantation in South Carolina of maybe 200 enslaved people. I don't think one is better or worse than the other. I think they're both bad. So that's another misconception, that because there was a lower number of enslaved people or because it was the American North, that somehow all of the parts of slavery, the cruelty, the family separation, the violence, the denial of humanity wasn't a part of it, which is not true. Another misconception is that slavery ended in the North really quickly, and it was totally, perfect because, we're so much better because we're Northerners, and that's not true either. I mean, the end of slavery in a place like Pennsylvania was a very drawn out process. It was very contested, and recent scholars have actually argued that the way that the end of slavery was designed was actually pretty oppressive and created new legal categories for people who were kind of caught between freedom and enslavement.
That's great. Thank you, Colin. And that brings up one question that came in on the chat is if you could talk about your process in terms of filtering what evidence made it into the reader. So for example, if there's a township in Montgomery County that's not represented in the reader, that's not an indication of lack of evidence, right? So if you could talk about the process by which these 103 pieces of evidence came to be in this reader, and if there's evidence that's not in here.
Yeah, and there is so much more evidence that can be put in the reader from the question, a place like Gwynedd Township. I don't know offhand. I would be surprised if there was no history of slavery there. I don't want to say every single township always, there was history of slavery, but I'd be pretty surprised if there wasn't something. Filtering the process is I looked at geographic regions. I wanted Lower Merion, okay, but I also wanted a place like Tinicum Township, which is right along the Delaware River, because the environment affected experiences of enslavement. Somewhere like Lower Merion, you don't have access to the Delaware River. Somebody who's enslaved right on the Delaware River, that makes daily life different. It was also geography, I wanted to get a diverse kind of picture. It's also random sampling a little bit of, okay, how do we decide? Just let chance. And also the evidence. I mean, some of the townships, the body of evidence is just richer. Some of the archives are there. In 1780, the state passed the first law called the Gradual Abolition Act, which slowly ended slavery. One of the features of the law was that it required county governments to create registers of enslaved people within their counties. So slave owners had to come to the government and say, here's who I'm enslaving. This is their age. This is a name if they wanted to give it. Not every county's slave register survives. Many of them are lost. Scholars have searched. So some places, a source like that, just we don't know. But we might have another source from that. So it's a little bit, selective based off of the source material, the area, and the kind of the random part of, okay, well, I have this from Bucks County, but what about Delaware County? So those are three kind of answers to that.
That's great. Thank you. And you also touched on a few questions I've seen about folks wanting to know more about certain things. For example, the Gradual Emancipation Act and what that was like and how it was implemented. And so more broadly, I think what we could ask is, for folks who want to learn more about this history, and there's so much to learn, of course, your reader's a wonderful start, and you have that 2-page list of recommended reading for those who want to continue learning. So I wondered if you could highlight a few of the resources that are in that recommended list and talk about why you think they help further public understanding of this history.
Yeah, a few of the resources are accessible, books that are written for public audiences about slavery. One of them is by a famous historian, Erica Armstrong Dunbar. Many people have heard of her book, Never Caught, about Ona Judge, and it's a woman that George Washington enslaved, and partially sometimes in Philadelphia. So that list has recommended reading. There's just unfortunately not a lot written about some of this stuff, like the Gradual Emancipation Act. There's some stuff online if you Google it. There have been some exhibits like the American Revolution Museum of the American Revolution. I forget the name. They just had a whole exhibit about James Forten, a free black sailor, entrepreneur, this amazing guy. In public exhibits, they might have a snippet about the Gradual Abolition Act. There's really not a ton out there. So I would encourage people to start maybe with the reader and to look. I have a section about that. The law is complicated too, and it's written in 18th century language, and it was amended several times, and there were loopholes. And there's one book that's really the book about it. It's called Freedom by Degrees. So if people are interested, that's in the list too. That's kind of the book to read about that law, and it's complicated. Yeah.
So helpful. Thank you, Colin. There's a few questions about, for example, with a fugitive slave ad, what could that look like for some people who might have escaped? Where were they going? Where might they have gone? You know, were they free? Were they recaptured? What were some of the dynamics after one might see a fugitive slave ad, like what you shared earlier?
So I'd say probably, um, first of all, we don't know how many enslaved people actually freed themselves because not every enslaver wrote and paid to post an ad if somebody ran away. So it's kind of difficult to know the statistics. Um, and some newspapers were not preserved, and so there's a source issue with that. The people who we do know, ran away, and there might have been an ad about them. Sometimes it's possible to trace them. There might be another ad, and then another ad, and another one. In the introductory essay for the reader, it features two women named Paul and Phyllis who their enslaver, a guy named Hugh Queen. He posted 4 ads for them, which historians interpret as, okay, well, he's still posting them because they must still be at large. People who, it was very, historians have said that for enslaved people to really successfully, totally, permanently escape by running away or whatever the tactic was, it was very rare. The majority of enslaved people lived and died enslaved, which is a very, kind of difficult thing to sit with because whenever I would find these fugitive ads, I'm like, yes, okay, yeah, here we go. And here's the tactics. And I'd be all into it on like Team Peter of like, let's go, let's get free. And unfortunately, a lot of times people were recaptured. Eh, I don't know that ad. That one of the more disturbing parts of this history is that ad of them as property of somebody posting a bond to recapture them. That's all that we know about their lives. That's it. There's nothing else. There's no more info. I don't know, where they were going or if they permanently became free. We don't know because all we have is this one ad about them as somebody else's property, and we have a few scant details. So there's this tension between the ads being this really tantalizing source that can be mined for, personality and genealogy and origins and skills. And on the other hand, it's totally opaque. There's nothing more. It ends. The story stops. The info is just gone. And it leaves people wondering, like, what happened to them? Like, can we know? And sometimes it's not possible. If people did become free, they still lived within a white supremacist society. So even if you're a free Black person, you can still be kidnapped. You can still be resold into slavery. There's a very good book in the recommended reading called Stolen by Richard Bell about 5 free Black boys in Philadelphia in the early 19th century. They're free. They were born free, who were kidnapped by this slave trading ring that was based in Delaware. And they were sold all the way down like in the deep South. And these kids were free. So Black people were never totally safe or secure. They're still don't have citizenship rights. I mean, even today, I would argue. So it's difficult. The fugitive ads are one of the richest bodies of source materials we have about enslaved people, especially enslaved resistance. They're also one of the most challenging, and historians have really debated with each other about how to interpret them, what they mean, what can they tell us. So a resource like the Reader, at least we have some of them in one place so that future people can, it's not every fugitive ad, but some of the ones that we had access to, and some of the ones that I thought were particularly notable, and they struck me in different ways.
Thanks, Colin. There are a few questions about just the numbers of the rewards and the assessments and the inventories, and getting a sense for the scale or the value or worth relative that we see there. And so, one question is about how the final highlight that you had about Joseph, about him being about 1/3 of the total estate that was tallied there. And a question about, what was the contribution of enslaved people's labor and enslaved ownership to, society in Lower Merion at that time? Is there any way to get a sense from the numbers about what the scale of that could have been?
I'm not sure. The economy of the area was not slave based. And it's kind of difficult because research is still ongoing. Just to plug Dr. Craig Bailey at Villanova, who he knows all, he has tracked a place like Lower Merion actually with slavery. Certainly it contributed to the economy, to society, to the development of these things we're still dealing with, like racism. Um, the question about Joseph and being a third of that, Anderson's whole estate. Yeah, I mean, and some of the slave owners in the area were pretty rich, and they were politicians, and they were, running the township, or they were running a church, or, they were the tax collector. And the question about enslaved people's names, that person's right. I mean, we really don't know. What name did Joseph actually have for himself? What did his parents give him? We have no idea. We just have him in the estate inventory. There are certain enslaved people like Thomas Crail and Judy Miller who are in the Reader, that's towards the end of the Reader, who actually changed their names. When they became free, they changed their names. They gave themselves new names. Or some of the ads say, my slave Dinah, who actually calls herself Susan something. And the owner actually acknowledges, yeah, I call her this, but she actually calls herself that. So if you hear a woman and she has this 3-name thing, that's that I want her back. So we don't know. And that's one of the really depressing things, that we don't even really know some of these people's names. Some of the enslavers didn't even bother to put the names of these people in the ad. Sometimes it was just a boy, a girl, and that's it. And so there's, that how do we deal with that emotionally? It's really difficult. So yeah, check out the Reader of some of those people like Thomas Crail, the man who enslaved him, Charles Humphreys. He just called him Tom, but we know from a deed record that he actually changed his name and adopted that name.
That's great. Thank you, Colin. One last question before we'll wrap things up. And thank you to everyone for the richness of the questions that you submitted. It shows, the impact of what Colin has pulled together. So I guess fast forward to a few years from today, how would we know that this Reader that you've created and the scholarship that you've done has had an impact? In other words, like, what are your hopes for what this Reader could galvanize?
I hope that people might learn about it, that they might talk about some of the people in the Reader, that they might question certain things that they think about and the place that they live. I hope to inspire people to do more research, to ask questions about, well, what about slavery? Or, if they tour a historic home or go to a site or in the area, to ask the question, or to think about their own family histories or their own community, or how they can greater understand our society, each other, that they might get meaning from this, that there might be a purpose to researching this and learning more, and that they can really think about these questions. These are really hard questions that people have dealt with for a very long time. And so I hope that people can learn about it, that people, share this history. That's kind of my goal. I don't think we're gonna, everybody not gonna know everything, but that it can exist, that people can learn about it, that they can rely on it, that they can challenge it, that they can find issues with it, and that scholarly discussion and debate, and also human discussion, and talking about these real issues, that can continue, that that the dream can live on, of people talking about this and making history matter to them.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Colin. Before I wrap up, I just wanted to say there's several questions about where to find this Reader. And so if you go to our homepage, lowermerionhistory.org, It's not as prominent as it should be, and we're working to fix that. But if you look under upcoming events and the information about this talk, there's a sentence that says Colin's Reader is available here. So if you click on here, it will download the PDF automatically. You can also email us at info@lowermerionhistory.org, and we will make sure that you have this information. So thanks again, Colin, for your presentation and for your inspiring and very dedicated work with us this past summer. And we also thank everyone who joined us tonight. On behalf of the Society, we invite you to join our public visitation hours. These are on Wednesday evenings at the Lower Merion Academy Building. This is the oldest school building in our county, in Montgomery County. It was built in 1812 on a large estate that later became home to the Ballackinwood Middle School. This is on Bryn Mawr Ave in Ballackinwood. We have an outstanding local and regional history collection, and our newest item is a printed version of Colin's Reader. I'll just show it here. So if you want to see it in person, please come visit us at the Historical Society. Our website is also an excellent resource for information about the history of the people and places in our community. And you can always reach us at our email address, info@lowermerionhistory.org, also on Facebook and on Instagram. Also, on our homepage, you'll see information about our next intern presentation. This is by University of Delaware undergraduate Bria Scarlett, who studied the records of the Women's Club of Ballackinwood over the summer. In her presentation, this is during Women's History Month, so March 26th, she will discuss her research into the earliest years of the club's 110-year history, including a look at the dynamic and inspiring work of the club, and also a look at who and who wasn't in the club and how that reflected the social dynamics of the time. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We just hope to see you soon at the Society at a future date or at an upcoming event. Good night, everyone.